Over the next 4 weeks, we're looking at the nervous system, and specifically through the polyvagal theory of Dr. Porges. And we're going to start with dorsal, which is the lowest one on the ladder, which is the freeze response. And we'll move up into the sympathetic arousal, which is fight and flight. And we'll also look at fawn, which is kind of a social survival response. So as we do that, my plan is for this time is to look at the nervous system overall, but also to look at how do we go into these, how does that show up in our own system? And then how do we bring ourselves out of that into ventral vagal, which is that state of trust and connect. One of the first things to say is none of these are unknown to us. We all go through all of these different phases. We tend to have a home away from home, as Deb Dana would say. Deb Dana is a social worker who works closely with Dr. Porges and has a lot of really practical ways to work with this. I like this quote from Resma Menakem, who is also a social worker. Many of you are familiar with him through My Grandmother's Hands, and he's on a lot of podcasts, his new book as well. So what this quote refers to, though, is how we see ourselves. So trauma in a person, decontextualized over time, looks like personality. And in a family, it looks like family traits. In a culture, it looks like culture. And so when we're looking at these kind of broad stereotypes we have of different types of cultures, there's probably a link back to the kind of trauma and the kind of survival responses, generally speaking, that group was allowed to have. When we look at this in terms of our own self or of people we know, we can really see that some people have a more of a fight response. We might say they're a hothead or something like that. Or we walk on eggshells around them because we don't want to set them off. As we're going through these, I'm sure there's people that come to mind. I know there is for me. Someone who's in more of a flight response, it's hard to get their attention. And right now, the last few decades with social media and with screens, people who have more of a flight response have a lot of opportunity to do that. So whether it's we're in a flight response by moving away or by working all the time or by being screens all the time, we can't engage with people in a flight response. And it's one of the ways that we protect ourselves. These are all protective mechanisms. Being a freeze response, there's a numbness to that. A lot of us recognize that. But also, if you're holding your breath, or when you're doing these breathing practices that we so often do, if you're finding that that's quite uncomfortable, that might also be a sign that you're in a freeze response. And then fawning is something we've probably all done, and we're certainly aware of being frustrated with other people who do it. So part of it is we see people kind of sucking up at work, and it seems to work. They get the promotion, they stay out of trouble, they align themselves with bullies. We see this sometimes in the political arena, that somebody who's clearly not a good person to lead, people kind of suck up to them, want to get in the reflected glory of their bullying personality, or maybe just to protect themselves from that person. So there's a lot of ways that this works, and we're very familiar with them. So freeze, that disconnected, dissociated, we're hunkered down for safety. So in the animal world, that might look like an animal who's actually goes into collapse state where they don't actually move. It looks like they're dead. And then when the danger's over, all of a sudden they spring up, shake it off, and away we go. So one of the things that human beings don't do is shake it off. We might go into a freeze response, and it might not be that we look like we're dead, but it might be that we're really holding ourselves tightly. That's where a lot of the tightness in our body comes from. We're holding our breath, or we develop a habit of holding our breath. And even when something really great happens to us, we don't really let it in that easily. It takes a while to get through that layer of numbness. And I've spoken before about how that's kind of being my home away from home. I don't tend to go into a fight response or flight. It's more I'll go into a freeze response. And this is another way that I have really been working with over the last, several decades is when a parent is in flight or freeze, what happens to the children. And so we miss the signs of danger. For me, it was I missed the signs with my partner, what was happening with my child. We just don't take in reality. And we see this all the time. It's like, I can't even deal with that. And then we just pretend it's not happening. I grew up in a home, and I know a lot of people really resonate with this as well. If we didn't talk about what was happening that was painful, then it wasn't real. And so whether it was, that our dog died or that somebody was in trouble, it was just completely ignored. And then what happens then is that we don't protect the people that are in our care, whether that's our parents with us or we as parents. There's a lot of impact from freeze that we might not necessarily think about. So when our children are around that, they often internalize that core deficiency belief of I'm unlovable, there's something wrong with me when our parents aren't engaged with us. Our relationships aren't as deep. So if you're in freeze, it's hard to know what you feel, it's hard to share. So, if we're looking at a relationship between someone in more of a fight response and someone in more of a freeze response, we'll often kind of blame that on the person in the fight response. It's not really a case of who's to blame, it's a case of what are our survival instincts doing and how is it limiting us. So it's not as scary for someone else to be around someone in freeze, that's for sure. And it's also hard to engage with us. So to come out of freeze then, and I think we can all agree that none of these are really ideal to be in, and that we also go up and down this ladder all the time. So we need to come from freeze up into sympathetic arousal, which is fight or flight. And only from there can we come up into ventral vagal, which is that state of trust and connect. So let's go into the inquiry. So as you're looking at these, you can kind of zero in to one of your experiences. Let's make sure that we're staying here in this moment in time. One of the ways that we do that is we get grounded in our body. It's often helpful to have your eyes open so that you can just anchor through your eyes. You could do that now as we're starting. You could hold your own hands. You could do some pulling back, do some tapping, put images into a frame. So the only way that we can heal, especially traumatic memory, is if we're here in this moment. So try to keep an eye on that. When you start, notice what your experience is with freeze. What does it feel like in your body? So for some of us, it might be I've been numb for decades. These are very persistent patterns that start in childhood and that continue on. Or it may be that you've been a bit numb. There's a bit of a coding that helps you to not feel things so deeply. And how do you know? What does it feel like in your body? Is it that you're holding your breath? Is it a sense of I don't even inhabit my body? I more think about how I feel, but I very rarely go into my body and feel. As we're looking at this, it's important to acknowledge that these are survival responses. So it can feel pretty powerful. And as we're doing these inquiries, these are so short, 10 or 15 or 20 minutes even isn't really long enough to really work through everything that's a part of this. So as you're working with it, you might want to work with something that's not a 10 out of 10. What are some of the impacts of freeze in your life? We miss out on experiences. We miss out on having the career we wanted because we were in freeze. We weren't even kind of thinking that we had an option to do something we would enjoy. It might be personal relationships. That might be one area that we could look into. And then the other one, and so you could pick one of these. The other one is if you have somebody in your life that is angry or goes into a rage, we will often go into freeze. And the feeling is, I can't stand it when they're mad at me. So then we go into some kind of managing their mental state or their emotional state. Let's sit with this for several minutes. What does it feel like in your body? And what is your personal experience? What comes to mind right now that you could work with? And make sure that you're staying here with your adult self. And so this doesn't mean that your adult self doesn't do these protective mechanisms. Freeze might be something that you still notice that you go into. Maybe it's still very persistent. Maybe it's not as intense as it was. It doesn't last as long as it used to. But it started somewhere when we were younger. You could work with a situation from the past or from the present, from this sense of our mature adult self. As we're noticing what it feels like in kind of a nuanced way. So when we're really in freeze, we're disconnected, we're dissociated, we don't really feel anything. But there's stuff that's underneath that we're not able to feel. So if you're thinking about or working with someone who feels dangerous to you or who's being abusive to you or who gets angry at you and you have to tiptoe around them, one of the reverse inquiries might be to say something like, it's safe for me to feel angry about this. And we're not talking about safe to express anger to them, just on our own internal experience. It's safe for me to feel angry. Or if we're looking at a flight response, I can get away from this. I could come out of freeze. I could say, I'm not sticking around for that. Or you can't talk to me like that. I'm leaving. And notice in particular, how does that feel in your body as you entertain? It's safe to feel angry, or I don't have to stay frozen. I could get away from this. Let yourself kind of feel it, but also to see it in your mind. Let yourself kind of bring it to mind with visual, with words, with your senses. Something that puts you into freeze. And then allowing that or opening up to that, coming up into a fight or flight response. And as you're attuning with that experience, notice if it's true. It feels safe to come out of freeze. Probably doesn't feel completely safe. Does it feel safe enough? Just in my own mind and heart, I could feel angry. I could let myself get away from this. I don't have to stay and freeze. And if it doesn't feel safe to come out of freeze, you notice that you're going back into freeze or you're anxious, then look to see why that is. Because the truth is, we have a lot of experience. We have experience of going into some kind of a response to threat. And it's our neuroception, our brains, our nervous system's assessment of whether or not it's safe to come up. And that is based on our experience. So when we were a child or a younger adult, all through up until right now, we might have a lot of repetition around this. It wasn't safe for me to come up. So I just stayed hunkered down. And is that still true right now in this moment? Not in this moment in your life with talking with other people, just as you're doing this inquiry. Is it safe for me to come up into a feeling of anger about this, or to let myself remove myself to flee or get into a flight situation? I can get away from this. It's safe for me to come out of freeze. And continue to notice your breath. If you're holding your breath in particular, if you could take some deeper breaths. And if there's any sense of shaming yourself, if you could let that go. Let's come up now into ventral vagal, into that state of trust and connection where we have access to self compassion. What does it feel like now to just have gone through this experience of inquiry, of seeing and revisiting some situation or situations where we've gone into freeze? And can we have a sense of connection with kindness? These are really difficult situations, especially for children. We don't choose to go into freeze. This is a trauma response, and it has a high cost. And now we're learning more about the nervous system. We're learning more that it's safe to not stay stuck in freeze so long. We can come out of it. We can experience fight or flight, that energy of sympathetic arousal. For a couple of minutes, let's sit with that sense of attuned empathy. And notice again in your body, does it feel like you're still in a bit of a freeze response? And if so, what would help you to come out of it? You might move your body, you might take some deeper breaths. Put your hand on your heart. And there's no particular right or wrong here. It might be, well, I still feel like I'm in a bit of a freeze, but I'm partway out, or I'm having some feeling of compassion for myself. How could we work with reality and also with kindness? Notice your feet on the floor, notice your breath, look around the room. And anytime as we're moving through our life, we can touch back into this. Once we become familiar with what it feels like when we're in a freeze response, we'll notice it sooner. And as we get more experience and we're paying attention to the experience, that it's okay to come out of freeze. We can come up into fight or flight. And then from there, we don't have to stay in fight or flight. We can come into this connection, this kind, compassionate connection with ourselves.